1961. A judge called Bumpy Johnson, a criminal. Bumpy nodded. Then the judge's secrets went public. The gavel struck the wood like a gunshot, silencing the packed courtroom. Judge Sterling leaned forward, sneering at the quiet man in the Italian suit, unaware that by speaking, he had just signed his own warrant. The air in the New York criminal court was thick, smelling of old varnish, stale tobacco, and the nervous sweat of guilty men. But Bumpy Johnson did not sweat. He sat at the defendant's table, his posture upright, his dark suit pressed to a razor's edge. He looked less like a man on trial and more like a chairman bored with a shareholder meeting. Judge Arthur Sterling did not appreciate the calm. Sterling was a red-faced man with a white mane of hair, a man who believed the height of his bench made him a god among mortals. He leaned over the polished mahogany, his robes bunching around him like storm clouds. "Ellsworth Johnson," Sterling boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "I have sat on this bench for 20 years. I have seen murderers, thieves, and liars. But you are something else. You are a cancer on this city. You dress like a gentleman, but we all know what lies beneath that silk." The courtroom held its breath. To speak to Bumpy Johnson that way in Harlem was a death sentence. To do it here, surrounded by bailiffs and the press, felt like madness. Sterling continued, emboldened by the silence. "You may walk out of here today on a technicality, but do not mistake luck for innocence. You are a criminal, a common thug masquerading as a king, and I will be the one to strip that crown from your head." Bumpy didn't blink. He didn't scowl. He slowly raised his head, locking eyes with the judge. The silence stretched, thin and terrifying. Then, Bumpy offered a single, slow nod. It wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an acknowledgement of receipt. He had heard the insult, and he had accepted the challenge. The black Lincoln Continental did not speed. It glided. As it crossed the invisible border onto 125th Street, the rhythm of the city changed. The stiff, gray hostility of downtown Manhattan melted away, replaced by the vibrant, pulsing heartbeat of Harlem. Inside the car, Bumpy Johnson watched the neighborhood through tinted glass. He saw the corner boys stop their hustling to watch him pass. He saw the old men playing checkers in the park pause their game to tip their hats at the bumper. In the courtroom, Judge Sterling had the gavel, the bailiffs, and the flag. But here, Bumpy was the landlord, the bank, and the mayor. The car pulled up to the curb outside the 22 West. Before the wheels stopped turning, a young man was already opening the door, his head bowed low. "Welcome home, Mr. Johnson," the boy murmured. Bumpy stepped out. He adjusted his cufflinks, breathing in the scent of roasted peanuts and exhaust fumes. It smelled like freedom. He walked into the club, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. There was no need for shouting here. His presence was enough to lower the volume of the jazz band and hush the conversations at the bar. He moved to his private booth in the back, settling into the red leather with a heavy sigh. A moment later, his right-hand man, a thick-necked enforcer named Whispers, slid into the seat opposite him. Whispers looked agitated. His hands were clenched into fists on the table. "The radio says he called you a cancer," Whispers said, his voice tight. "He disrespected you in front of the whole city, Bumpy. You want me to send a couple of boys to his house tonight? Break some windows? Maybe break a leg?" Bumpy lit a cigarette, the flame of the lighter illuminating the hard lines of his face. He took a long drag and exhaled a plume of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "Sit down," Bumpy said softly. "You think like a hammer, Whispers. That's why you'll always be muscle." "But the disrespect is a trap," Bumpy cut him off. "Sterling wants a war. He wants me to act like the savage he described. If I throw a brick through his window, I prove him right. If I put him in the hospital, I become the monster he needs for his re-election campaign. Bumpy leaned forward. His eyes cold and dark as obsidian. He attacked my character. He attacked my name. A man like Sterling thinks he sits on a throne because he wears a robe. But he forgets something. What's that? He forgets that robes have pockets, and men with pockets have secrets. Bumpy tapped the ash from his cigarette. I don't want his legs, Whispers. I want his reputation. I want to strip him down until he stands naked in front of the same city he told to look at me. Bumpy signaled the waiter for a coffee. No guns this time. Bring me the phone book, and bring me the list of every maid, driver, and doorman who works on the Upper East Side. The most dangerous weapon in New York City wasn't a Thompson submachine gun or a switchblade. It was a mop. It was a silver serving tray. It was the steering wheel of a black town car. Most men like Judge Sterling saw Harlem as a containment zone, a place where the help lived before they commuted downtown to scrub floors, cook meals, and drive limousines. They saw the people of Harlem as invisible, furniture that breathed. They spoke freely in front of them, argued with their mistresses in the back seats of cars, and left incriminating papers on mahogany desks, believing that the woman dusting the bookshelf was too simple to understand what she was reading. That was Sterling's fatal error. He didn't realize that every maid, every doorman, and every driver reported to a higher authority than their employer. They reported to the neighborhood, and the neighborhood belonged to Bumpy. 3 days after the courtroom insult, Bumpy sat in the back office of a quiet barbershop on 135th Street. The shades were drawn against the afternoon sun. On the desk in front of him sat a neat stack of cash, not a bribe, but compensation for risk. The door creaked open. An elderly woman stepped in. She was wearing her Sunday best, a hat pinned carefully to her gray hair, clutching a patent leather handbag. This was Mrs. Calloway. For 15 years, she had been the head housekeeper at the Sterling residence on the Upper East Side. Bumpy stood up immediately. He rounded the desk and pulled out a chair for her, waiting until she was seated, before he sat back down. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Calloway," Bumpy said, his voice low and respectful. "I hope the ride over was comfortable." "It was fine, Mr. Johnson. Your driver is a polite young man," she said, smoothing her skirt. She looked nervous, her eyes darting to the door. But her jaw was set with a quiet anger. "I heard what that man said to you in court. Called you a savage." Bumpy smiled faintly. "He called me a criminal, ma'am, but sticks and stones." "He's a hypocrite," she spat, the word landing heavy in the quiet room. "He walks around that big house like a saint, talking about law and order. But saints don't have 2 phone lines in their study, and saints don't burn ledger pages in the fireplace at 3 in the morning. Bumpy leaned forward, his interest piqued. "He burns papers?" Mrs. Calloway reached into her handbag. Her hand trembled slightly as she pulled out a folded, charred piece of paper. It was fragile, rescued from the edge of a grate before the flames could finish the job. "He missed one," she whispered, sliding it across the desk. "He was drunk. He's been drinking a lot lately." Arguing on the phone about markers and deadlines, Bumpy picked up the fragment. It was scorched, but the handwriting was legible. It wasn't a legal brief. It was a list of debts, significant debts, and names that Bumpy recognized. Not judges or lawyers, but bookies, dangerous ones, the kind that didn't care about a robe, only about their money. "He's in the hole," Bumpy murmured, reading the numbers. "He's gambling. And he's losing." "He brings women there, too," Mrs. Calloway added, her voice dropping to a hush. "When his wife is in the Hamptons, young girls. He pays them out of a safe in the library behind the portrait of his grandfather." Bumpy looked at the woman. She was the invisible machinery of the city, the silent witness to the rot of the elite. Sterling looked at her and saw a servant. Bumpy looked at her and saw a soldier. "You have done a great service, Mrs. Calloway," Bumpy said. He pushed the envelope of cash toward her. "For your trouble, And for your retirement. I think it's time you quit that job. It's getting too dirty for a woman of your standing." She took the envelope, nodding slowly. "He thinks he's untouchable, Mr. Johnson." Bumpy placed the charred paper into his breast pocket, right next to his heart. "Nobody is untouchable, ma'am. They just haven't been touched yet." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a universe away from the gritty pavement of 125th Street. Here, under the cascade of crystal chandeliers, the air didn't smell of exhaust. It smelled of orchids and heavy French perfume. This was the annual Law and Order Charity Gala, the night when the city's wolves dressed up as sheep to congratulate themselves on keeping the herd in line. Judge Arthur Sterling stood in the center of the room, a flute of champagne in his hand. He was the man of the hour. His polls were up. His crusade against the Harlem element had played well in the papers. He was surrounded by the mayor, the police commissioner, and the wealthiest donors in the state. They laughed at his jokes and patted his back, their touches reaffirming his invincibility. "You really gave it to that Johnson fellow," the commissioner chuckled, swirling his drink. "Calling him a cancer? That's the kind of plain speaking this city needs." Sterling preened, adjusting his white tie. "One has to be firm, Commissioner. These animals mistake our civility for weakness. We must remind them where the line is drawn." The orchestra began to play a waltz. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd like ghosts, carrying silver trays laden with hors d'oeuvres. They moved with a synchronized precision that went unnoticed by the guests. To Sterling and his friends, the staff were just moving parts of the scenery, as functional and uninteresting as the drapery. But if Sterling had looked closely, if he had truly seen the people serving him, he might have noticed something. He might have noticed the hard set of their jaws. He might have noticed the look in their eyes when they poured the wine. It wasn't servitude. It was anticipation. At exactly 9:01 p.m., the signal was given. It wasn't a shout or a gunshot. It was a nod from the head waiter, a man whose brother ran a numbers racket on 116th Street under Bumpy's protection. The waiters fanned out. They moved among the tables where the city's elite sat. But they weren't clearing plates. They were placing small, cream-colored envelopes next to the centerpieces. Sterling was in the middle of a toast to moral fortitude when he noticed the ripple. It started at the back of the room, a murmur that cut through the music. He saw the mayor pick up an envelope from his table. He saw the police commissioner's wife open hers, her hand flying to her mouth in a gasp of genuine scandal. The murmur grew into a buzz, then a silence that was colder and sharper than the winter wind. Sterling frowned. "What is going on?" He looked down at his own table. There was an envelope there, resting against the stem of his wineglass. It wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to the people of New York. With a trembling hand, Sterling picked it up. Inside were copies. Photostatic copies of the charred ledger pages Mrs. Calloway had saved. And not just the ledger. There were photos, grainy but undeniable, of the judge entering a townhouse that was definitely not his home, accompanied by a woman who was definitely not his wife. And next to the photos, a list of gambling debts owed to the very crime syndicates Sterling claimed to be hunting. The blood drained from Sterling's face, leaving him gray and waxen. He looked up. The room had turned on him. The smiles were gone. The backs that had been patted were now turned away in disgust. The mayor was hurriedly whispering to an aide, distancing himself with frantic speed. The commissioner was staring at Sterling with the look of a man watching a leper enter a nursery. Sterling dropped the glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the sound exploding in the silence. A waiter stepped forward to clean up the mess. He crouched down at Sterling's feet, picking up the shards of glass. He looked up, locking eyes with the ruined judge for a brief second. "Careful, sir," the waiter whispered, his voice calm, mocking. "Glass houses." Sterling spun around, looking for an enemy to fight, someone to yell at. But there was no one. Bumpy Johnson wasn't even in the building. He hadn't crashed the party. He hadn't fired a shot. He had simply let the truth walk in through the service entrance and serve itself on a silver platter. The judge stood alone in the center of the ballroom, drowning in the middle of high society. Executed by a ghost. Riverside Park was desolate at midnight, a strip of shadow caught between the stone retaining wall and the dark, churning water of the Hudson. Judge Sterling sat on a bench, huddled inside his trench coat. He looked nothing like the lion who had roared from the bench days earlier. He looked small, shivering not just from the wind off the river, but from the terrifying realization that his phone had stopped ringing. His friends, his donors, his party, they had all gone silent. He heard footsteps, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Bumpy Johnson emerged from the gloom under the street lamp. He wore a long wool coat and a fedora brimmed low. He didn't check the shadows for police. He knew the park was empty because he had decided it would be. Sterling stood up, his movements jerky and desperate. "Johnson, you came." Bumpy stopped 5 feet away. "You asked for a meeting, Judge. I'm a reasonable man." "This has to stop," Sterling hissed, his voice cracking. "The photos, the ledgers, you've made your point. I can help you. I can make the charges disappear. I can give you the city. Just call off the dogs." Bumpy looked at the man. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "You still don't get it, do you? You think this is a transaction. You think we're trading horses." "I have power!" Sterling stepped forward, trying to summon the ghost of his authority. "I am still a judge. If I go down, I take everyone with me. I'll sign warrants for every associate you have. I'll burn Harlem to the ground." Bumpy laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You don't have power, Arthur. You had a costume." And I took it off. Bumpy took a step closer, invading the judge's personal space. The air between them grew heavy. "You want to know how I did it? You think I broke into your safe? You think I tapped your phone?" Sterling stared, bewildered. "How?" "You gave it to me," Bumpy said softly. "You gave it to me every time you treated a maid like furniture. Every time you spoke freely in front of a driver because you didn't think he had ears. You built your life on the backs of people you thought were invisible. But I see them, and they see everything." Sterling slumped back onto the bench, the fight draining out of him. He realized the magnitude of his mistake. He hadn't fought a gangster. He had fought a community. "What do you want?" Sterling whispered, defeated. "Money." "I don't want your money," Bumpy said, turning his back on the man. "I want you to know that it wasn't a criminal who took you down. It was the people you stepped on." Bumpy began to walk away, his silhouette merging with the darkness. "Wait," Sterling called out to the retreating figure. "What happens to me?" Bumpy didn't look back. He simply raised a hand in a dismissal. "That's not up to me. That's up to the law you love so much." In the distance, the wail of sirens began to rise, cutting through the night air. They weren't coming for Bumpy. They were coming for the man on the bench. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed again. But the air was different. It didn't smell of fear anymore. It smelled of caution. The mahogany bench, where Judge Sterling had once thundered like a god, was now occupied by a new magistrate. Judge Harrison was a younger man. Careful and soft-spoken, he shuffled his papers nervously, his eyes flicking toward the gallery, checking the faces, making sure he wasn't stepping on the wrong toes. He knew exactly why the seat was empty. He knew why his predecessor was currently facing a grand jury for corruption and solicitation. Bumpy Johnson was not in the courtroom this time. He didn't need to be. Miles away, on the corner of 125th Street, the morning sun warmed the pavement. Bumpy sat in a folding chair outside the 22 West, a newspaper spread across his lap. The headline screamed in bold black ink, "Judge disgraced. Sterling indicted in vice scandal." Bumpy read it without smiling. He folded the paper neatly, creasing the face of his enemy until it disappeared, and set it aside. Mrs. Calloway walked by, carrying a grocery bag. She was wearing a new coat. She paused, catching Bumpy's eye. She didn't bow. She didn't shake. She gave him a sharp, dignified nod, the kind of nod one general gives another. Bumpy touched the brim of his hat in return. He watched the street, the hustlers, the workers, the children playing stickball. They moved around him in an orbit, bound by a gravity that the law couldn't legislate and a gavel couldn't command. Judge Sterling had learned the hard way that power isn't a title you are given. It isn't a robe you wear. Power is the people who answer when you call. And in this city, when the gavel struck the wood, it made a sound. But when Bumpy Johnson nodded, it made history.